Hello, welcome everyone to today's webinar discussing Pearl-2 and simplifying live video production using Pearl-2. I'm seeing tons of people in chat, which is awesome. I still see people trickling into to my salon here. So we'll get started here in just a few minutes. So welcome everyone. Lots of people in chat from all over the world, which is fantastic. I've seen people from the UK, France, all over the US, India, UAE, several people. So this is awesome. Thanks so much for joining and for your continued interest in these webinars. See some people from Germany as well. This is awesome. So still seeing people coming in here. So we're just going to hang out for a few moments, continue to say hi in chat. I'm going to take another sip of coffee. I have learned from my mistakes on not having coffee during these webinars and solved it. People from Belgium saying hello. Perfect. Perfect. I hope everyone is well. I hope everyone is continuing to stay safe and be well. We're going to get started here momentarily. Throughout this, we will have polls going up. So please weigh in on those polls. One should be up right now. Just asking you what sector you're in. There's a few different options there. We're always curious to learn, where people are coming from in terms of their sector, but also if you're already a Pearl owner, how you're using that. So that information is always helpful for us in terms of planning out future updates and things like that. So please weigh in on those polls. There'll be a few others going up throughout today's webinar. Still seeing some of our numbers coming up a little bit, so don't want anyone to miss anything. So we'll just get started here. Just a few moments, another minute or so, I think we'll get rolling. All right. Great. Lots of people in there. Sorry, I keep rubbing my hands. It got surprisingly cold again here in Ottawa, Canada. We had a beautiful weekend of summer-like weather, and now it's gone back to freezing. So a little bit chilly. We'll fix that though. All right. I think our numbers are starting to stabilize here, so we'll get started. So once again, welcome everyone to today's webinar. Today we're going to be discussing and demonstrating and really trying to get hands-on with a Pearl-2 and how you could use it to simplify some of your video production workflow. As diving in on a lot of the tools and features that Pearl has to offer, and hopefully giving you some insight on how you can leverage it. There is a Q&A panel here, of course, so throw your questions into the Q&A and we will get to them. If it's relevant to a part of the discussion when I get there, may bring that in right away. Otherwise, I may hold several of them until the end and we'll go through that. If anyone joined us for the previous webinars where we covered Pearl Mini, that was 2 weeks ago now. We took a break last week. Some of this will be pretty familiar, but there are some things that are a little more unique to the Pearl-2. So we'll definitely be looking at that. So that's fantastic. Let's get started. So first thing, let's bring up what we're talking about today, and that is the Pearl-2. Pearl-2 is designed to be a all-in-one standalone hardware box for live production needs. Switching, mixing, streaming, recording, all of these things at the same time. As part of that, it means that we have several different physical variants of the Pearl-2. The most common one you see out there is the portable or the desktop version of it, which is a small form factor box. We actually ship it in a hard, rugged case straight out of the factory. So it's a Pelican style case. So if you're someone who's going to take it on the road with you to different events and venues, maybe not now, but in the future, then the portable version, the desktop version, the standard version, whatever you want to call it, is very convenient and very common for using in those scenarios. Unlike its little brother, the Pearl Mini, we do make rack mount versions of the Pearl 2. Specification wise, they're the same. They're basically just rack mount versions. So 2U, standard 19-inch rack, whether that's a permanent installation or whether you're building up a portable rack system with other gear, these can be a great choice for that type of environment. And many of our larger live event companies do use the rack mount versions in smaller portable racks that maybe are only 6U in size. Pearl 2 being 2U, really helps to minimize the amount of space it's occupying in that rack. For some of those biggest clients, they actually need multiple Pearl units, whether one's being used as a hot standby or whether they're just load balancing across multiple units or whatever the case may be. That's where the Pearl 2 rack mount twin comes into play. The twin is literally two Pearl 2s as though they were sitting side by side on the table, sharing one chassis. The advantage here is that you get two independent systems, completely independent of each other, their own network interfaces, their own power supplies, their own storage, their own video inputs, everything. But instead of occupying, 4U of space like two of the normal rack mounts would to have multiple, it's still just a 2U rack with two units side by side. So this really helps to minimize the amount of space required to have multiple units, especially in a portable rack. So that's something to consider as well for some of those of you who might need, a higher density installation of multiple units. The other thing with the Pearl 2, and this applies to all of those models, is the optional 4K add-on. So Pearl 2 basically comes in two software variants, if you will. The base version, which will support up to full HD, 1920 by 1200, that kind of thing. We can optionally add 4K support. That 4K support adds the ability for 4K inputs, two HDMI 4K inputs, and two SDI 4K inputs. These are 12G SDI capable inputs. It also enables some other 4K style features like maybe hardware downscaling from 4K to HD if you need it, or streaming and recording in 4K, as well as the HDMI output ports being capable of 4K as well. Now, that being said, not everybody needs 4K. So that's one of the reasons why it's an optional thing. The other advantage here is that if you maybe don't need 4K today and you bought a Pearl 2, but 6 months from now you suddenly found that your workflow has evolved and you do need 4K, you can add this later on without having to change any hardware. It's just a software license edition to unlock those 4K abilities essentially, so that maybe you don't need it now, but you need to enable it later. That's an option you have. So when we line up the Pearl 2 next to its little brother, and some of you may have seen this slide before, one of the main reasons to look at a Pearl 2 is how much power it has packed into it. It's a much more powerful device than the smaller Pearl Mini. And so it really is for someone who needs a lot of multitasking or a lot of inputs and maybe some other optional, more studio level features. So, input wise, we can capture, stream, and record in up to 4K with that optional add on. We have 6 physical direct inputs with 4 HDMI and 2 SDI. We also have up to 2 optional USB inputs that could be used for USB webcams or USB audio devices. There's also analog audio devices with 2 balanced stereo pairs of XLR inputs. So that's 4 total physical XLR. There's also optional RCA inputs there as well. And then there's the main difference here, the big one to really consider is how many encoded program outputs do you need at any given time? We call them channels, and you'll understand that a little bit more when we look at the UI in a moment. But these are encoded outputs for live streaming and recording. When we're doing that in 1080 at full HD, Pearl 2 could be as encoding as many as 6 simultaneous encoded outputs at full HD. So we could be using some of these for ISO recording. We could be using some of these for mixed and switched program feeds for live streaming and recording, or whatever variant they're in. Those encoded programs are independent of each other, so you can really leverage them to do whatever you want. Um, so 6 in HD. If we're streaming and recording in 4K, 4K is much more demanding on the system, of course. So we do have to reduce that down. And typically, we recommend a single 4K encoding channel. Sometimes you can squeeze a little extra on top of that, but generally, it's a single 4K encode. One of the other things here is that Pearl 2 also has the ability to bring in IP-based video signals as well. This could be RTSP streams from IP cameras, or even supporting NDI. NDI, for those of you who are not already familiar with it, although I suspect many people are, NDI is a network stream protocol that's becoming extremely popular, especially in the studio space, where running cameras and other devices over NDI, leveraging your network instead of having to run cables, can be very beneficial. And it also helps open up the ecosystem beyond just HDMI and SDI based devices. So many PTZ cameras are now coming with NDI. There's lots of NDI converters, which once you're using maybe a video signal to NDI converter, uh, means you can have it on a wide range of your network and get it back to one place without worrying about special cabling. So that can be a great piece. NDI also allows us, as someone just put into the questions, Eric just put into the Q&A there, using things like New Blue Titler over NDI. Um, so that's another option that we can use with NDI, including Pearl 2 supporting NDI alpha channel. And that can be a great piece, as some people are doing, to bring in external titling pieces. The other thing the Pearl 2 can do, that its little brother cannot, is chroma keying. So this is using green screens, or maybe not using an NDI based thing, but a direct input from maybe a non-titling software if we want to do this on the cheap, or with what we have already. You could build PowerPoint slides that you could key the background out of, and create titling that way if you really wanted to. These different elements and these different tools that are part of the larger Pearl um, toolbox can be very beneficial. Storage wise, for our recording, Pearl 2 uses an internal 500 gig SSD to store those files. We can move those files after the fact, and we'll dive into more details on that when we get into the UI. So that's pretty much it for my slides. I'm going to transition here over to our UI. Um, but just before we do that, I'm just going to take a look at some of these questions. Um, let's see. So Eric, I see your question there about NDI. That rings a bell. I think you may have also emailed us about that. And I think we were trying to look into that because I have not seen that happen before. That is very odd behavior. I haven't seen that. We use New Blue Titler with NDI Alpha all the time. We're doing it right now, and I've never seen the audio cut out when you're bringing those in. So I would need to understand more about your setup to be honest in how I address that question. I'm sorry, I'm not really in a position to dive into that at the moment during this webinar, but I believe you did reach out to us already, so we'll definitely dive into that with you. I think we were trying to investigate that a little bit on our side, but it's not something I've seen happen before, so that is odd behavior. Another question here: could you use the USB input to have normal cameras with capture devices, just in case we need 8 cameras? Okay, so one of the things to consider here is that um, Pearl 2 is very much based around using 6 inputs. Um, And this is a question of system load. Um, when we bring in additional inputs, whether it's USB, NDI, RTSP, these are actually more work on the system than using HDMI or SDI. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Our recommendation of using 6 inputs on a Pearl-2 is a total of whatever combination. So while you could certainly, there's nothing to stop you from using the USB inputs with capture cards like our AVIO series to bring in additional inputs, it may negatively impact performance of the system. Um, it's hard to say because there's so many variables as part of that resolution and so on, how many encoding channels you're using, and so on and so on. Um, but what we outline in the specs in terms of 6 inputs, 6 total encoding outputs, those things, that's based on safe limits that we know the system can handle performance wise without negatively impacting the performance. So, um, you could do it. There's nothing to stop you from doing it, but it, it may not be the best scenario depending on some of the other factors and some of the other workflow you have on the system. Um, so the here's the main administrative UI. So I'm actually accessing this Pearl-2 remotely. This is not one that I have physically sitting next to me. This is one that's sitting in our office, in our demo studio, which is very empty at the moment due to current global conditions. I'm hosting this webinar from home and we're remote producing it. But one of the big advantages of Pearl is that I can remotely access it through the cloud and gain full access over the system to configure it, to use it, to monitor it, to operate it in a general way. So this can be very beneficial for people trying to do remote production, especially under the current conditions we find ourselves in. So that's something that could be helpful. The way we're doing that is with a system that we call AV Studio. Now, this is something where Pearl will give you a pairing code that you can pair to your AV Studio account. And in AV Studio, which you can create an account for free at avstudio.com, when you pair your devices, they show up in a list, and you can see I have several of them sitting in my lab area and in my studio. I have a button here to log into it remotely. And when I do that, and obviously it needs username and password and things along those lines, but when I do that, I can gain access to the full administrator UI and all of the functions as though I was local to the unit. As it is a network based appliance, the main UI, the main administrative tasks are all done using a web browser on any computer device that has a web browser. There's no software to install, there's no plugins to install. Any web browser will do. Um, Basically, we just need the IP address, the login credentials, and there we go. So if you've ever configured or used your own home router for your internet connection and configured that router, it's the similar idea as a network appliance. You go to the IP address, a login comes up, and you log in and you can change all the various different settings. So that can be a great way to manage the device. That being said, in a recent update, it is also now possible to use a local console on the Pearl by connecting a monitor and a keyboard and mouse over USB, the monitor over HDMI to one of the HDMI outputs. And when you enable that local console, you can use this full admin interface on that monitor over HDMI with USB keyboard and mouse without needing to do it over the network. So many of our customers who use these devices on the road, in order to try and minimize the amount of kit they bring, they may choose to use the local console to try and simplify parts of their workflow. So that's one thing to note. Here in the admin, I don't know how many people joined us for the previous webinar. I don't know that I'm going to go through every single one of these configuration sections in detail. I may skip some just in the interest of time, and really today focus on the pieces we might need primarily for production. So just to let you know. I'm just going to take a look over here at questions and see if there's anything here. There is another poll, a couple of polls that are up asking about some of your workflow needs. So there is a poll asking about typically how many video inputs do you need in your productions, and also whether or not you have ever used NDI before in the past. So weigh in on those polls. It's really, really helpful. Um, so let's see. I see Kristen asking a good question here that is somewhat relevant before I dive a little deeper. And I see Richie also noting in chat there, does Perl Mini have the local console function? Yes, Perl Mini does have the same local console function as well if you're running the most recent firmware 4.11. Okay, back to Kristen's question. Can an operator use the equipment while another person is connected remotely checking the settings? Yes. So the administrator UI, this one that I'm on now, you can have multiple people using this at the same time. Um, the Epiphan Live interface, which is often used for operators, and we'll dive into what this does more later. Epiphan Live is a single instance on its own. So only one person can use Epiphan Live at a time. If you try to connect multiple times, it'll kick someone out. The admin is not limited in that way. It can have multiple people at the same time. So if your operator is using Epiphan Live and you need to make adjustments as an admin, that's not a problem. That's easy to do. All right. So here in the admin, obviously there's configuration sections for everything you could ever need. There's things like firmware upgrade, some maintenance things, serial port configuration, network time and date, very, 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 very basic things that you would expect on just about any type of device. But some of the ones I want to highlight here are things like security. Um, Many of our customers, especially within enterprises, big companies, we've seen this more and more in universities and education institutions as well, are kind of under the gun for security mandates and making sure that anything that is a network based appliance is conforming to those security mandates can be extremely important. For those reasons, Perl has some of the most relevant security options available. This can include using HTTPS for the web browser based UI. You can enable that. You can set it up. You can use your own security certificates if you want. We also have options for using 802.1x hardware authentication on the network as well. So this is a pretty high level method. Basic breakdown is if a network is using 802.1x authentication, if you don't authenticate with it and you're plugged into the network, you don't actually connect. So if you're in a position where this is part of a security mandate, either today or later on, Perl is equipped and ready to go with the highest level of security options here. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. The other thing that we can do, and this can be a usability, but also a security one as well, and that's the front touch screen. So some people were mentioning here in chat about Perl Mini having a touchscreen. Both Pearl-2 and Perl Mini have a touchscreen with the same functionality. They're different sizes, but they're the same functionality, and they both have it. On both of them, you can disable it entirely if you don't want people to be able to use it, or you can choose to filter out some of the functionality of the touchscreen. So, for example, if you don't want your operators to be able to mess around with network settings from the front touchscreen, you can disable that portion of it or disable some of the other pieces depending on what you need to do. You could also just lock it out with a PIN code. So, if this is a situation where you just want to physically protect the unit to make sure people can't mess around with it, you can lock it out with a PIN code and make sure that the touchscreen is protected in that way. All right. So the other thing we can do, because one of the things we can filter out of the touchscreen is applying configuration presets. Now, this is found in the maintenance menu. The configuration presets can be a valuable tool if the Perl is being used in multiple ways by different people for different use cases and needs. a shared device essentially. What we can do is we can build up the system, save a preset of how we built it up, and then someone could change it to a different configuration and save that preset. Then they can recall these presets as they need to transition from event A to event B, whatever the case may be. You can also download these presets to back them up in case you ever need to restore it, or to upload it to another Perl if you have multiple of them to clone that configuration on multiple boxes. So this can be, again, a very powerful tool when we're trying to manage multiple units, especially. All right, I'll probably skip over a bunch of these other ones here and really dive into um, managing some of our content. And usually I start from the bottom and go up, but I'm going to change it up a little bit today, just so that we can look at things in a little bit of a different way. Um, so the first thing we want to touch on is the various different inputs. So you can see here a list of all of the various different video and audio inputs on the Pearl. There's the HDMI inputs, the SDI inputs, the USB inputs, and then all of the different embedded audio and analog audio inputs. On each of these, when we click on one of them, let's say this HDMI input, it will show us an automatic detection of what that input signal is. In this case, it's full HD that is coming from a computer. Um, and it will show me a slowly refreshing snapshot of what's coming in on that signal. Gives me some, very basic information here that can be helpful for me to know what's happening with these. But one of the other things I can do to try and help me is I can actually rename these. So I know that this one's coming from a computer. So I'm going to call it PC. I know that this second one, HDMI B, is a camera that's pointed towards normally where I would be standing. Again, full HD coming in. It shows me the snapshot of that camera shot that's sitting there. So again, I could call this, whatever I might need to in order to help logically organize these pieces to help with my production. I don't have anything connected to HDMI 4K-A, but I do have one on HDMI 4K-B. It's another full HD input from another camera, um, and it's coming in this way. So this camera we set up temporarily just to add more sources. So it's actually pointing to the front of the other camera that you saw, which is just a Canon G20. This is actually a PTZ camera that we're not fully utilizing at the moment. Currently, I don't have much connected to the SDI, but I could. So I have 3 inputs currently active on this unit. So it's definitely not maxed out, but it's fairly common actually to see somewhere between 3 and 4 inputs on a Pearl-2, despite the fact that 6 is the recommended total. The other things that we can look at here is the HDMI audio inputs. So this is just embedded HDMI audio. Each HDMI and SDI input on the Pearl could be capturing embedded audio. As well, we could be using the analog inputs. When we have audio coming in, you'll see that we do have an audio meter here. That's just the microphone and the camera. It's picking up some background room sound. So there's not a whole lot going on there. But we can see those levels. One of the things we can do here is if we're finding that we're having an audio and video synchronization problem, we do have the ability to change the audio delay from minus to plus 300 milliseconds and whatever in between in order to compensate for the video being behind or ahead of a video signal. Sometimes this happens even when using embedded audio where video and audio are coming from the same device. Sometimes that sync is a little bit off depending on the device, and we can make adjustments. I've seen cameras that need a plus 90 millisecond adjustment just to realign the audio that's coming from the camera. So something to keep in mind. Usually small delays are not noticeable, but once you get into the 100 plus millisecond range, people would start to notice lip sync from a talking head. So things to keep in mind, and that you do have that adjustment option if you need it. On the analog inputs, again, Pearl-2 has 4 physical XLR inputs. These are usually used as 2 separate balanced stereo pairs. We can separate them individual monos if we want. But the most important thing here to keep in mind is that these XLR inputs are line level only. They're set up for pro line level. They're not microphone level, and they do not provide phantom power. What this means is usually we're bringing the audio in from a mixer or a preamp or an existing audio system that's serving as, again, that preamp, that is something that's providing phantom power to microphones and so on. And then taking the line level signal out of that equipment and into the Pearl. Again, we have the audio delay settings if we need to make those adjustments. And those 2 analog inputs are separately adjustable. You'll notice that all of the audio inputs are separately adjustable. So if they're all slightly different, we can make those adjustments. If we need to add things like RTSP or NDI, we can click on this Add Input, and it will give us an option of bringing in either adding an RTSP input or adding an NDI input. I don't have any NDI sources on that subnet currently. I wish I did, but not being able to go into the office and set some of this stuff up has proved challenging. But in general, one of the advantages of NDI is auto discovery if you're part of the same network. So if there were NDI sources available, it would list them here, and I would be able to pull them in. It's not totally dissimilar from what we can do with RTSP, with the exception that RTSP is manually added. So for fun, I'm actually just going to jump over to a Pearl Mini that I have here, and I'm going to pull the RTSP feed from this Pearl Mini as an input onto the Pearl-2, just so that you guys have an idea of how we might be able to do this. So when I click Add an RTSP input, it's going to ask for some basic information, including the URL, which I'm going to paste. Again, this is basically the exact same way we would do it for an IP camera as well, where we would have RTSP, an IP address, port, and then a URL. If there was username and password necessary, we would input those. Different cameras sometimes use different transport, whether it's TCP or UDP. There's an option here for using hardware acceleration. This is sometimes a compatibility mode question. So again, if you're finding odd things, try toggling that. But with this, I should be able to hit the check button here, and it should be able to detect that that input and show me what's coming in. So it connected after a few seconds here, and it's now showing me that it detects that it's an H.264 video codec at full HD at about 25 megabit for a bit rate. So that's obviously set fairly high. And then it also has the audio coming in as well. Gives us some stats, and it gives me a snapshot preview, and it gives me an audio meter, just like we saw with any of the other inputs. And we would get the exact same thing with NDI as well once it's applied. So it's that easy to add an RTSP, even easier to add NDI inputs to a Pearl. This now, as you see, is listed as part of my overall video input list here, and I can use it. The USB inputs are actually fairly similar. When we have a webcam connected, for example, the capture mode menu here will show the modes that camera is capable of. Different cameras will announce different mode capabilities. So that's, it'll show what's only available. You can make adjustments for brightness and contrast and so on. And of course, if we're bringing audio in over USB, then we do have gain and delay settings there as well. And one thing to note here is that we also have the option when using any of the video inputs, HDMI, SDI, USB, any of them, to change the no signal picture. So you'll notice that right now I have this very boring black and gray no signal picture. It's effective, it's literal, that's nice. but sometimes we want to be able to dress it up a bit or brand it. We could upload an image like a JPEG image or a PNG image, um, and apply that as our no signal picture. And maybe it's branded, maybe it's a technical difficulties picture of our own choosing, whatever you want. And that becomes our no signal picture for that particular input. We could actually load different uh, signal pictures for each and every input individually. So they could all have slightly different ones. Some people choose to label those pictures with the inputs that they're applying it to, so that if someone pulls out a cable and you suddenly lose signal, it's maybe slightly quicker to troubleshoot what happened and correct it. So each input has that as an option. So with our inputs coming in, one of the things we can look at is inputs going out. And the first way we want to look at that is HDMI outputs. We touched on the local console option already. Pearl-2 has two HDMI outputs, and they are assignable with different things. So one of them could be used as a local console, or it could be assigned to use one of our encoding channels, meaning that any of our mixing and switching that's being done in that encoder would be reflected. So this could be helpful as a confidence monitor, or passing that signal to a room next door for a breakout session or something like that. If it's being used as a confidence monitor, we can even mirror it if we want to help our talent know their lefts from rights. We can enable audio meters so that people can see the audio meter and understand that the audio is in fact working. We can enable actual playback of audio over HDMI. Maybe it's going to a next door room or something like that, to a TV, and we need to play the audio. We can do that as well. Or we can assign one of our input ports more like a pass through. So I could assign one of those, and it would function more like a loop through. Um, so that's another workflow that can be handy depending on what you need. Again, each of those output ports can be assigned differently. So you could have one that's a confidence monitor, one that's a pass through, whatever you need. You can fine tune that for your particular needs and adjustments. Probably the most important outputs, though. Actually, I'll come back to this just in a moment here because I did see some questions coming in here, and one of them was upvoted quite a bit. And that was, how many NDI inputs can it take simultaneously? So, technically, we don't have a hard cap on the number that you can input. However, we do have some recommendations, and it will depend on whether or not it's a regular NDI input or an NDI HX input. We do support both input types on Pearl-2. Um, so if we're talking about regular NDI, one of the considerations is, of course, bandwidth. It's much, much higher bandwidth requirements. So that could be a limiting factor. When it's NDI HX, processing load to decode and re-encode an H.264 stream is a little bit higher. So we need to take that in. Usually, we recommend 2, 3 NDI inputs simultaneously, but like I mentioned in a previous example, it really depends on what other things you're doing. If you were using Pearl purely as an NDI receiver and no other inputs are being used, you could probably do 4. I've heard of some customers managing to do 5, to their own taste. So there's a huge number of variables to that question, and so it's difficult to give you an exact number. Many of the things that we've implemented on Perl don't have hard caps. You can push it way beyond what we recommend if you want to, but obviously there's the risk of performance. So you can experiment with it and you can push it. Generally speaking, though, we recommend somewhere between 2 and 4 as a maximum, depending on some of the other functions that you're using. This is all calculating up to a total system load. So I hope that helps answer that. The other upvoted one, and since it's related to inputs, I'll address this one as well. This one was upvoted very highly here, and that's the allowable length of cable distances for HDMI and SDI. So basically, Pearl is no different than those standard specifications. Generally speaking, in my experience, if you are using copper HDMI cables, for example, probably the maximum length you would want to run is 50 feet. If you want to invest in higher quality fiber-based HDMI cables, 150, 175 feet, no problem. We do that ourselves quite often. That's not a problem. So it depends on the cable and the equipment being used. SDI, one of the big advantages of SDI, besides being a locking connector and being a broadcast standard, one of the biggest advantages to SDI is that it can run really long distances. So 300 feet, 350 feet are not uncommon for SDI. It's a more durable cable, more durable connector. It has the twist locker on it. So for long cable runs, SDI is great. And again, if you look at the spec standard for SDI, you will see that there are lengths recommended for that, and it will vary. And 12G will be different from 3G, for example. Um, Usually, the higher resolution you go, the higher frequency it is, the shorter it might be. But in general, running a couple hundred feet with SDI is usually not a problem. Um, Second part of that question there is using extenders. You can definitely use Cat5 extenders with HDMI. Your mileage may vary depending on the ones you buy. We've experimented. Oh, I know Cameron's listening in the background, but I've lost all track of time with all this COVID stuff. So, but maybe a couple of months ago, maybe more than that, we did an episode of our Thursday live show where we actually talked about extenders. And we experimented with using some pretty cheap HDMI, like monoprice HDMI extenders that were very inexpensive, but we found that they did have limitations on the length of Cat5 cable you could use before they didn't work. So, depending on the ones you buy, there's also going to be limitations on those. That being said, let's just say you needed to run HDMI 100 feet. Buying a cheap monoprice HDMI extender for 40 bucks and then buying a $20 100-foot Cat5 cable is going to be cheaper than buying a fiber HDMI cable. Is it better? I don't know.
Meh. That was 4 months ago, George.
4 months ago. All right, perfect. Thanks, Cameron. Um,
Yeah, we'll post a link for that one in the comments here.
yeah, so someone will post the link there, but that's a great episode where we kind of looked into that. So honestly, I'd be tempted to almost recommend the fiber just because they're also a smaller dimension, but they're also more fragile. So six of one, half a dozen the other, right? It's kind of your choices. The other part of that is using SDI cable with HDMI ends. So that's a signal conversion. They are not passively adaptable. They must be full signal scan converted. The two signals are completely different. So you're talking about using fairly high end equipment, converting from SDI to HDMI and vice versa. That can get expensive. It's definitely possible, and with a good quality converter, no problem doing it at all. And many of our customers do that. Um, but yeah, you're looking at some broadcast quality kind of stuff for that level. But those are definitely possibilities. Um, so let's see. Let me take a look here. I'm looking at questions that are related to inputs at the moment, since that's the subject matter we were on. So one of them here, Richie was asking, will USB hub work to gain some USB inputs? No, it's not how the way that Pearl mounts those devices works, unfortunately. Um, Also, generally speaking, hubs create a bottleneck for throughput. So, depending on the types of devices you're using, let's say they were capture devices like our AVIOs, running those or multiple of them on a hub is a terrible idea because it bottlenecks the bandwidth and you'll end up with reduced frame rates. So, it's not something we would recommend. And the way Pearl mounts and identifies, it only has two USB input possibilities. You can't add more than that. So even if the hub, could help it wouldn't beyond two. Let's see. Sorry, I'm just looking through some of these other questions here. So Michael was asking about delay. Aside from the inherent HDMI delay, or if using SDI inputs, what's the internal delay of the HDMI outputs? So that's a good question. It is a bit of a variable. So the HDMI outputs on Pearl-2, since they're not physical loop throughs, since they're assignable, changeable, and manipulated, they are not physical loop throughs, and so there is some delay to them. The delay will depend on what you're passing through. Passing through an input to an output is usually the lowest, um, whereas passing through, a program channel is going to be a little higher. Typically, you're usually somewhere between 100 and 200 milliseconds, depending on the setup and some of the other factors on the system. Um, so again, it depends on what your system load is and how you're managing that and what exactly the assignment is. But typical is between those. Um, all right. So one of the most upvoted questions here, I'm going to get to that in a moment since that's really more of an encoding question. So I'll address that in a moment. I think. Um, okay. So one of the questions here that Michael's also asking about was about frame rates on the front touch screens, in terms of the thumbnails having a lower frame rate. Um, No, the 2 pearls would be basically the same in that regard. That's actually intentional to reduce system load. Rendering of all of those thumbnails at full frame rate would dramatically increase overall system load, and especially on a Pearl Mini, with less headroom for that kind of thing, not something you would wanna do. So yeah, I mean, even in Epiphan Live as a dashboard over the network, the frame rate is not the true frame rate. It's reduced in order to minimize bandwidth and system load. So unfortunately, that's a necessary trade-off, in order to make sure that Perl can do what it actually needs to be doing, which is the encoding part. Okay. All right. I'm going to leave the questions there for now. I'm definitely going to get to all of those. Don't worry. They are just more relevant once we get to some other parts. So, the next thing I'm going to do is talk about channels. The easiest way to think about channels, and I understand some people here today might be coming from broadcast world, more traditional broadcast equipment, where the terminology for channel is often used as inputs. You'll notice that we call inputs inputs. We when we use the term channels, a channel in context of a Perl is an encoder. Channel equals encoder. What that means is that we can create multiple encoders. They're independent of each other, but every channel you create, and you can see I have two here at the moment, but every channel that you create is a new encoder that is running and operating and is creating system load. So if you think back to the beginning where I was mentioning about recommended of maximum of 6 full HD encoders, I'm talking about 6 channels, 6 individual encoders. Um, Beyond that, we may start running into performance limitations. Um, so the terminology is a little bit different, if you're used to the more broadcast oriented world. But the easy way to think about this is a channel being an encoder, which an encoder being an output for streaming and or recording. Just like the inputs we were experimenting with before, we can name these. So maybe this first one is going to be, my program. I can name that, no problem. Um, and underneath each channel, there are subsections here, submenus that are unique to this specific channel. My other one will have its own set of these. And there will be status, encoding, our layouts, streaming, recording. I'm going to start from the bottom here. Recording wise, each individual channel encoder can be recording itself at the same time as the others are also recording. So again, if you think about it, if we had 6 encoder channels, that means 6 separate records happening at the same time if we want. No problem. The options within this are to choose a container type. We can choose from AVI, MPEG-TS, MOV, MP4, MP4 fragmented. And the choice you may make here really will depend on your workflow. If you're bringing in this into an editing post-production workflow, which one of these is going to be most compatible. If you're distributing it to other viewers, what are those viewers using? If all of your viewers of these files are Mac users, it's probably no real benefit to using an AVI file since it's not natively supported. If it's a huge mix, then using MP4 is going to be the most universal. So there's some choices to make there. One of the things to keep in mind is that MP4 as a container natively is not fault tolerant. So if you're recording an MP4 and you suddenly lose power, you lose the data. That's why MP4 fragmented is an option here. MP4 fragmented is a variant of MP4 that is fault tolerant, and essentially means it finishes the file in small chunks periodically and then automatically puts them together so that if you did, let's say, lose power in the middle of your recording, the most you might lose is 10 seconds of data. The rest would be preserved instead of losing everything. So again, if you're in an environment where fault tolerance is important, make sure that you're choosing the appropriate container. Some of the other options under here are things like creating file name prefix. By default, the file names will be the channel name and the time and date stamp, or the file name prefix and the time and date stamp. So you can see there's files that have been recorded over time here from various different demos, and they have different names based on when we've changed these. So you can put in here whatever you want to try and help organize those files, but it'll always be either the channel name and the prefix and the time and date that the file started recording. The other thing we can do here is set triggers to break these files into chunks automatically. This can be based on either a time limit or a file size limit, whichever comes first. Usually, these days we see people setting the time to the max unlimited and setting a file size that's going to be appropriate to chunk sizes that are going to be beneficial to their workflow. So maybe distributing it over smaller thumb drives means we need to limit it to 4 gig chunks. We can do that. Maybe just to make sure we're uploading more frequently or not waiting for uploads as long, we might choose smaller chunks and stitch them together in post. There's a lot of reasons you might choose this depending on your workflow. The single largest file that a Pearl-2 can create is 64 gig. Depending on some of your encoding settings, that could represent a lot of time. So again, just to look at how much you really need this. But if we set these to the maximum values, then we could essentially just run it as a manual start-stop operation if that's what we're looking to do. You'll see some other options in there for automatic file upload, and that will address some of the questions we have there right now. So I'll kind of dive into that in a moment. When we have these files recorded, we can download them through this UI. We can delete them. We can rename them to whatever we want. We can even play them in a web browser, opening them in another tab if we wanted to, and it would play that file. So there's a number of different ways that we can leverage that piece to be able to see what's happening. If we just want a quick confidence check on that file, we could open that in a tab and play it. So there's a few ways that we can leverage how we use that. That playback, since it's running from the Pearl over my remote connection, is running a little bit slow since I'm doing all these other things. So I'm not going to pull that up at the moment. But anyway, that's there. Again, each channel that you create has its own set of this. So they could all be creating their own individual files, depending on what you're doing. The advantage here is that if we create multiple channels, some for ISO recording, some for program mix switch, we could record them all. So we could have 4 or 5 ISOs and our program all at the same time. Um, each file created on its own for you to do as you please with afterwards. The other way that we can do recording is with this part called recorders, and this is a common area that we see many people a little bit unsure which one they should be using, the per channel recording versus creating one of these recorders. I'm going to pause for coffee. The only reason really to create one of these recorders is if we want to leverage the unique ability it offers of creating a multi-track file. And what I mean by that is it records a single file that has multiple video and audio tracks contained within it. This is a fairly unique and fairly uncommon thing to do with video. It's very common to see, files with multiple audio tracks, but multiple video tracks is fairly unique. The advantage is that, of course, you're getting a single file that has a synchronized start and stop for each of those different tracks, placed all into one file. Many of our customers who use Pearls in fairly unique ways, like security or in simulators where they're recording instrumentation, any of those types of scenarios where they don't really care about post production. They're not looking for that. They're looking for just a large aggregate of all the different pieces together. This can be a great workflow because when you take this file and you play it in a media player that's compatible with Multitrack, which are not very many, VLC is one of the few, it would open VLC would open a different window for every video track and play them simultaneously. So this can be a helpful tool, but it can also be an unhelpful scenario for the more traditional live event type of workflow, where you're probably better off using the per channel recording individually so that you have individual files. Pearl can split them apart here. You can choose, you want program video and camera audio or whatever, and Pearl will extract those specific tracks and give you a file that you can download. You can definitely do that, but it's an extra step. So, whether or not that fits your workflow is kind of up to you. But the multi-track nature of these is really what it's all about. So I'm going to call it that. So we can have that as a reference. Again, I would say the vast majority of Pearl users are going to use the individual channel recording. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. It's not necessarily right or wrong here. It's just, what's going to fit your workflow the best. Again, the downside with multi-track, just like I mentioned with players, most video editors don't understand a multi-track file. They will only see the first track in the file and ignore the others. So it's just the way they're built. All right, back to channels. So after recording, the other thing we have is streaming. So streaming can be done in multiple ways. One of the most common ones, of course, is using RTMP push to send it to a YouTube or a Facebook channel or Twitch or Vimeo or Crowdcast like we're doing right now for you guys, or whatever platform, Microsoft Stream, IBM Cloud Video, our partners at StreamShark, whoever it is, RTMPS push to whatever CDN platform you happen to be using. We just create an instance, we give the server URL, stream key, and if required, username and passwords, and that's basically it. We can actually create multiple instances if we want, and you'll actually see here that from previous demos, I could create a whole bunch of, different RTMP push instances, maybe one for Facebook, one for Vimeo, one for YouTube, and then I could also create an NDI output for my local network as well. I could actually have all of these running simultaneously, provided I have the bandwidth on my network to support it. Pearl has no problem doing this because within this one channel, I'm only encoding once. I'm basically just packaging it multiple times. So this can be a huge benefit if I need to stream to multiple platforms simultaneously. We, on our weekly Thursday show, we do Facebook, YouTube, and Twitch simultaneously from one Pearl, no problem. It's very straightforward. Many people might choose to do different platforms. Last week, we were helping a media company produce a live event, and they were streaming to YouTube to a sort of a hidden channel and to another CDN that was embedded on their website. Um, that's a fairly common practice to kind of have these different directions so that different audiences can see that information. So RTMP and RTMPS being the secure version, you'll notice on this Facebook one, RTMPS, we just have to put in the RTMPS URL, and that's all we have to do. Straightforward, nice and easy. Coming back to NDI streaming, we do support NDI outputs as well as NDI inputs. We do not support NDI HX outputs at this time. It's only just the regular lightly compressed NDI. So this can help you expand that workflow maybe beyond your HDMI outputs if you need to send it to a monitor or to a breakout room or something like that over the local network. You could use NDI to fit Pearl into a larger NDI workflow if you want. There are some other options that we can leverage here that are basically just local area network options. So we could enable UPnP, meaning that Pearl would have a stream available with auto discovery over UPnP. So this could be a smart TV, a set-top box, something like that, that's connected to the same network that would detect automatically the stream that Pearl has and be able to play that stream on one of those devices. So that can be handy. Similarly, we have an optional setup here for HTTP live streaming, aka HLS. The current implementation is direct unicast local area HLS streams. So it's really there to add compatibility for iOS-based viewers, iPads, iPhones, to view streams directly from Pearl natively without needing any sort of special apps or software connected to them. And that's because iOS doesn't support much natively aside from HLS. So that's there as a compatibility option. All right. I'm just going to check and see if there were any questions about streaming. Aldo is asking here, how many channels or encoders can you create? Like my answer for NDI, there is no capped limit to this. However, for performance reasons, we recommend a maximum of 6 if you are encoding at full HD 1080. If you're doing less than that, you might be able to get away with 7 or 8. It's a variable, but there's nothing in the settings to physically cap you from creating more, and I'll show you how we do that in a moment. Wayne, how often will Pearl come out with a newer version of Pearl Mini? Pearl Mini is pretty new still, so there's no plans for that. Pearl-2, there's no current plans to replace that either. But I don't really have anything I could tell you here today other than, to kind of stay tuned. We might have some stuff to talk about, coming into the summer. But at the moment, I don't really have anything to share with you. And there's no set timetable for those things. Tom can talk about Epiphan Live and yes, I will definitely be talking about Epiphan Live versus admin. Just hold on for that. Marcelo, about recording, if I understand, it's possible to record individual files of 6 inputs Yes, exactly. You have understood correctly. You can record individual files for as many channels encoders as you've created. And again, a recommendation of 6 means that you can have 6 individual recorded files simultaneously, be those individual inputs, depends on how you create those channels, or program mixed and switched channels. Totally up to you, or some variant therein. We'll talk a little bit about how we leverage that multitasking in a little bit. But yes, absolutely. You understood correctly. Um, okay. Okay. So Eric was asking there. Um, so I did already answer that one about recording per channel versus the recorders. So I'm going to get rid of that one. There's a question here about, um, okay, I might come back to that one because it's a little more complicated. Um, Marcelo, if I'm using 6 PTZ cameras into a single controller, could we easily connect the controller to a Pearl-2? If by controller you mean an external mixer that's bringing those pieces together, then sure. I mean, Pearl would see that as just a single video input. If you're talking about just purely a PTZ controller, like a joystick that's doing Visca or something like that over serial or IP to control those cameras, then that's kind of separate. Pearl's not aware of that type of controller itself. But if it's taking 6 video inputs from those cameras individually, and then you're using a separate Visca controller to control the movements, sure, no problem. That's just kind of up to you on the workflow. Um, Aldo asking how many audio feeds can we use in one channel? I'm going to get to that um, here in a moment. Um, Aldo asking how many channels can we create, and each channel can they be multi-streaming? So again, the recommendation is a maximum of 6 at 1080 full HD channels encoders. Yes, each one could be multi-streaming if you have the bandwidth to do it. That's purely a bandwidth question. Multi-streaming itself doesn't add a ton of load. The number of channels does because those are encoders. But multi-streaming within a channel like I have demonstrated here, we're not re-encoding for each of these. This channel's encoded once, and then we're wrapping it multiple times to go to those. So then it becomes a bandwidth question. I hope that makes sense. Um, all right. John asking for those of us who have never used NDI, what would be used um, at the output stage to view the stream on a local network? There's a ton of options for NDI. There are NDI monitors, like physical displays that can ingest NDI streams to view them. That's becoming more and more common. There are NDI converters that can take NDI and output HDMI to another display. There's software that can do that. One example would be Skype actually supports bringing in NDI signals into Skype. So you could create a full program within Pearl that you're live streaming and recording, create an NDI output, and bring that into Skype to use that as the camera in Skype for a Skype call. There's also an NDI toolkit that you can download from NewTek's website. NDI is a NewTek technology they created, but there's a toolkit you can download. The Windows version is much better and more involved than than the Mac version, but in that toolkit, there's lots of ways that you can watch NDI on a computer. All kinds of different things. It's really a question of what is your workflow and how do you need to make it work. The idea with NDI is to have a huge ecosystem of mixed devices operating all on a single protocol to make it easy plug and play to use all of them. Kristen asking, can the multi-video record be viewed in Kaltura, edited in Kaltura? If you mean the multi-track, No, because Kaltura doesn't do multi-track. The Kaltura integration is a little bit different from some of the things we've touched on so far. I might come back around to that because that's very different from doing, a lot of the live event production typical stuff. So I might come back around to Kaltura here for a moment. Okay, let me go back up here. All right, so that's streaming. And again, each channel can have its own streaming stuff. So I click on my other one here and I haven't configured any streaming here at all. So they're individual, they're independent of each other. One of the next most important things here per channel um, is how we encode those. Again, these channels are encoders, just to reiterate that. And whatever we're doing streaming and recording wise in each of these channels is going to be dictated by what we set here on the encoding page. Pearl is a hardware H.264 encoder. That's the codec it's optimized for. That's the codec it's built around. And that's what it excels at. And that's what allows it to be able to do these 6 individual encodes simultaneously, is that that's what it's built for. There is the option of using Motion JPEG as a legacy codec. It's extremely rare to ever need that these days, but it is there. Generally, we're talking about using H.264. H.264, standard codec, widely used all over the place for live streaming and recording. The big advantage here is that there's nothing proprietary about it. You can use it however you need for streaming, recording, editing, and so on. There are some settings here within standard H.264, like encoding presets, hardware versus software. Hardware is what we recommend. Again, that means that Pearl's leveraging the H.264 hardware encoder that it has built in, where software would have to be done in the CPU, which increases our system load dramatically. However, there are some older instances where, for compatibility reasons, you might need to use the software encoder instead. It's less common, but it's still theoretically possible. And then H.264 has encoding profiles, baseline, main, and high. Honestly, these are mostly compatibility questions. Very rare that we need to change this. There's very little difference between them, honestly, other than some editors or some streaming platforms might have a particular preference for what they're using. The next ones are frame size. So by default, when we create a channel, this checkbox will be enabled. And you'll notice that there's a message here that says, uncheck if you're switching multiple layouts to a fixed frame size. What that means is when we have this enabled, Pearl will automatically detect the resolution of the video input coming in, let's say 1080p, and match that one-to-one in our encoding. However, if we're going to be creating mixed things, picture in picture, side by side, or switching between multiple inputs, we can't use that auto detection. We must uncheck this and set a fixed frame size. Otherwise, every time we make a switch, the encoder will redetect a signal and the encoder will have to stop and start, which will interrupt our stream and our recording. So setting a fixed frame size is pretty important for the majority of workflow. When we set a fixed frame size, there are some options here down the side. These are standard selections, but they're by no means a limitation. So 16:9 aspects, these are the things that most people are using today, like 720 and 1080. You might have a unique workflow where you need to use 16 by 10, like 1920 by 1200, so on. You might even need to use 4:3 aspect if you're using a unique workflow with older devices. You might need standard definition 4:3 aspect stuff. So and again, someone asked about PAL things. PALs, there's some important things to look at when we're talking about regional standards like PAL, NTSC versus things like full HD, 720p, and so on. PAL as a standard encompasses multiple things. It encompasses a frame rate, a refresh rate, and a pixel by pixel resolution. PAL as a resolution is actually really low and terrible. Same with NTSC as a pixel by pixel value. These are not HD standards. So when we start talking about HD standards, we really are talking about things like 720, 1080, but then we also have to add context of the frame rate, because things like 1080 and 720 in a European region, in order to be compatible with the old PAL television broadcast standard, uses different frame rates, sometimes different refresh rates. The thing is that in the world of streaming, it's kind of irrelevant, because we're not talking about television broadcast. We're talking about live streaming. Live streaming is typically based around 30 FPS, 60 FPS, things like that, 120 FPS in some cases. It's not based around television broadcast standards. Now, definitely a lot of cameras that are built for the European market and other markets, are built around the idea of using the older PAL standard to conform to, because they expect people to plug them into televisions. Um, but they also typically have settings, especially modern cameras, ones you would buy today, will should definitely have options for 30 FPS, 60 FPS, and so on, because everyone's building these things now for the new media, the streaming media, if you will, that are not based around those old television broadcast standards at all. So it's one thing to keep in mind there. The question that was also being asked was, we're missing the options to capture 25 frames per second. Pearl can capture it. Generally, what you're mentioning there is that typically under those conditions, if I understand your question correctly, many cameras will use, in order to conform to that old PAL television broadcast standard, they'll use 1080i at 50 hertz. First of all, you don't want to use an interlaced signal for live streaming without deinterlacing it, because it will look terrible. Interlaced signals don't compress very well. They look awful. So at the very least, you need to deinterlace it, which Pearl can do. If you take a 50i signal and convert it to progressive, it becomes 25 FPS, like you mentioned. We can definitely capture that on a Pearl. That's no problem. Of course, if we're doing that, we need to make sure that we set our encoding to 25 FPS, because if we set it to 30, then we have to fill frames somewhere. We have to duplicate frames somewhere to make up that 5 FPS difference. So we can definitely do that. You can set it to 25 FPS, and it should line up. That shouldn't be a problem. However, my general rule of thumb is, look at the cameras you have, look at the other video infrastructure that you have, and if you are not planning on using any of it for actual television broadcast, convert it all to 30 FPS, 60 FPS, and so on. It's going to make your life a lot easier in the live streaming world. It just will, and it'll look better, and it'll compress better, and it'll stream better. So that's, it's challenging, because we're kind of in between these two worlds of the old television world and the kind of current going forward streaming world, which is obviously taking over and becoming the new standards. So, but yes, you can definitely do that. The other things to look at here are keyframe intervals. So in the encoding world, a keyframe is how often you insert a full frame. When you're compressing and encoding video, many of the frames are interpolated, and only looked at as to what changed, in order to minimize how much we're putting in there. Keyframe is a reference point, a full frame, and how often we insert that impacts quality to some degree, but it also impacts the size of recorded files, the amount of bandwidth required to stream it, and so on. This value, you really have to say, if this is a channel for live streaming, we should be setting this value to what is recommended by the streaming platform we're using. Facebook and YouTube are great examples where they recommend a 2-second keyframe interval. So that's why it was set to 2 seconds. Other platforms may recommend one. I've seen platforms recommend 5. I don't know why, but they do. Whereas if you're doing purely recording and your goal is to have a high quality record, you might want 0.5 second or 1 second insertion of keyframes. It's going to make your file sizes a lot bigger, but it'll make the quality of the video better as well. Frame rate, again, go with what's recommended by the platform you're live streaming on. Again, Facebook and YouTube always recommend 30 FPS, 60 FPS, that kind of thing. So setting that to match those recommendations. And then bitrate. Bitrate is a bigger one because this might be one of the single most important settings when it comes to encoding. It's going to dictate our image quality, it's going to dictate our file sizes, and it's going to dictate how much bandwidth we need to live stream that encoded stream. So I have this sit for 5,000 as a demonstration because that's a fairly common one for YouTube, Facebook, that kind of thing at 1080p. 5,000 kilobit per second roughly translate to 5 megabit per second. So if we're looking at these settings, we also need to do some math to know whether or not we could actually successfully stream 5 megabit over the bandwidth we have available. My general rule of thumb is to take your bit rate, multiply it by 1.5, or ideally by 2. That's the amount of upload speed that you would need for one output stream at 5 megabit. So 5 megabit times 2 is 10. You would need a minimum of 10 megabit upload to successfully stream this with some headroom. The reason why you need headroom is the bandwidth always varies. And if anyone else is using the same connection, they're going to be occupying a chunk of that as well. And you don't want to bump up against that because if you do, that's when you start to drop out data, and that's bad. So doing those calculations to see what you can do. 5 megabit for 1080p, like I say, is fairly common. If you're looking for something slightly higher quality, you might go to something like 6.5 megabit. If you wanted to do 60 FPS, you might want to be at 12 megabit, double the frame rate, double the bit rate. So there's some general rule of thumbs here, but again, most of those platforms are going to give you a recommendation on what they think you should use for a bit rate based on the resolution, 1080 versus 720. One of the advantages we have here with Pearl is that if all of our inputs are 1080, but we're having issues with bandwidth and we just maybe can't support streaming in 1080, we can set our frame size to 720, and then we can probably bring our bit rate way down to something like 2500 and cut our bandwidth needs in half. That's no problem. That's one of the advantages of Pearl, is that we can change these encoding settings to scale up, down, whatever we might want. The other thing we could look at doing here is audio. So I'm just going to go, actually, what I'm going to do for a future demonstration is I'm going to set this to 1080 at 25 megabit. And when we start talking about bit rates like 25 megabit, we're usually not talking about live streaming unless we're trying to live stream 4K. We're usually talking about purely high quality recording, because 25 plus megabit, we're starting to talk about like Blu-ray levels of quality for recordings. So it's pretty high. But anyway, that's for a future demonstration we're going to get to in a second. So I'm going to set that as this is going to be my master, super high quality record. My audio settings here, I can choose between AAC, MP3, and raw PCM audio. What I would choose here, again, is going to be a preference based on my workflow. If I'm live streaming it, I'm definitely going to be using MP3 or AAC. Go with the one the platform recommends. You'll find that AAC is probably the most common today. And similarly, we have different sample rates. So if we were looking at ultra high quality recording, we would probably be looking at PCM, raw audio, at 48K. If we were live streaming it, very likely you would be doing AAC at 44. Since I already did my ultra high quality thing, I'm going to set this to that. You'll notice now I don't have a bitrate selection because I'm not compressing the audio. If I did select one of the compressed options, then I have bitrate selections here from 64 to 320K for my audio compression. So again, I'm going to go back here and I'm going to apply this. This setting now for this is for this channel. It means my streams out of this channel and my recordings out of this channel are going to be encoded in whatever I set here. One of the things that this can be beneficial on, I'll show you in a second here, and I know we're running long, We'll get here. We'll get there. There's a lot to talk about with this stuff. The next most important part, and maybe singularly the most important part of a Perl in general, is the layouts. Layouts, you can think of these as scenes. They're talked about as scenes in software applications like OBS, Wirecast, vMix, things like that. Our layouts, different term, but the same idea. The idea being that you can build multiple of these layouts and you have a canvas that you can create whatever it is that you want in these layouts and then switch between those layouts. So that first one just has a full screen of my PC input. The second one is actually showing, a side by side, and I'm using a background image. Um, and I can create basically as many of these as I want, and transition between them, on the fly for my switching. So this is an important note. In the more traditional broadcast world, switching is typically done or thought of as being done as literally switching inputs. Perl doesn't literally switch inputs. Perl is just switching between layouts of scenes of whatever you've made those layouts to be. They could be a single video input, they could be multiple video inputs, could be a single still image, whatever you want. And that's what we're switching. So in this case, I have two HDMI inputs put here. If I want to switch here, I don't create, I don't say switch this one frame from HDMI A to HDMI B. No, I would basically duplicate this layout and make a version of it where it's different. So it's a little bit of a different workflow to what you might be used to, but that's what we would be creating. And again, creating as many layouts as you need, and then transitioning between them. As an administrator, that means just clicking this active shot button. As an operator, maybe using Epiphan Live, as someone asked about, it would look a little different, and same with the touchscreen. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to build a layout here from scratch, just to kind of demonstrate some of the ways we might leverage this. So to build one from scratch, I would click New Layout. By the way, we can name, just like everything else we've been doing, where I can give it a name and I can hit enter and name that layout so I can help logically organize which layouts are which. I now have this blank canvas. Earlier, we set my encoding settings to full HD 1080. This canvas represents 1080. I can then start adding items. So the first thing I'm going to add here for fun is I'm going to add my first camera. I'm actually going to make this full screen. And you'll notice that when I'm doing this, it's a click and drag style interface to build this when I add elements to it. So I'm going to make this full screen just by clicking and dragging the corner. Super easy. Anybody can do this. I'm then going to add another piece. I'm going to add a picture. And I'm actually going to add this semi-transparent PNG image of our company logo. I'm going to overlay it in the corner as a watermark. I'm then going to look at audio inputs, and I'm actually going to add my different audio inputs here. I'm going to add both of my HDMI audio inputs, which means my camera microphone and the audio that's coming from the PC input are actually being mixed together for this layout. So one of the questions that Aldo had was, how many audio feeds can you use in a given channel? The question goes deeper than that. It's how many audio inputs do you want to use per layout? Each layout could have a different selection of these, so that not only am I switching video, but I'm also switching audio in between these. So I can choose all of them if I want, and they'll be blended together in my encode. So one of the things you might do, and I'll come back to this in a moment, when I get to my other piece I was going to demonstrate that I set up the encoding for. This is going to be my main mix that I'm going to send out. So I'm going to save this with that audio. The other thing I'm going to do here for fun is I'm going to play with cropping and chroma keying. So one of the things that we can always do is we can always crop a signal down if we want to. Again, it's a click and drag style interface to choose what it is that I want to crop down to. Whatever I feel like cropping or not, because I'm first going to play with chroma keying. Because what I'm going to do is enable chroma keying, and I'm going to sample my green screen back here. And basically, I've now keyed out that green, which means I can now add for fun another image that I'm going to put into my background layer here after I position it. Put that as my background. And now, just as an example, I've created a window that I've keyed out, and I now have something behind it. Now, normally, when I'm actually there in the studio, I have a much better way of demonstrating this to maybe stand in front of the green screen, key myself out, and overlay myself on top of the slide presentation or something like that. Honestly, very much like what you're seeing right now, I am not, in fact, if you're looking at my camera shot on the webinar, I'm not, in fact, in our studio. I'm actually at home with a green screen behind me. Pearl can do the same kind of thing, to key that stuff out. So you can play around with this. And just to give you some ideas, some of the ways we might set this up. Some of the other options, of course, that a lot of people will use are going to be the side-by-sides and that kind of position. Those are pretty common. I may have just lost. Yeah, okay. Bear with me one moment while I reconnect to my Pearl. We've been running for a while, so that connection actually timed out. We have that set up automatically for a number of reasons, but it's inevitable that was going to happen at some point. All right, so the other way we can look at things is side by side, right? So like this layout, I could have one of my inputs that's going to be my presentation. I could have a background image. I can play around with a bunch of things. I could also have a video shot that I overlay. And in this case, I cropped it down to narrow the frame if I don't need the full thing. Crop that down and put that up there. One reason I might do that is maybe someone is standing at a podium, and that's what I need to crop down to. There's lots of ways to play around with this stuff creatively. Maybe someone's standing at a podium and there would be a talking head there. I don't know. I'm just goofing around. But again, you can use PNG images. You can use JPEG images. If they're PNGs with transparency, then they give you all kinds of fun, creative ways of creating overlays and watermarks and things like that. So don't hesitate to be creative in how you do that. And the biggest advantage is that with click and drag, it's so easy that anybody can do it. So, all right, so that's enough on layouts, unless there are some questions on it. So Paul, since I was talking about encoding earlier, I answer Paul's question here. What is the minimum internet speed to stream one HD stream? So the example I gave there was full HD at 5 megabit. You can do 1080, like full HD at about as low as 4 is usually the minimum recommended bit rate. So again, apply that math. 4 times 2, 8. That would be the minimum upload speed you would want to stream one full HD. Generally speaking. All right. I know we're running really long here, guys, so we're going to try and speed up a little bit. I hope you can keep up with me. Please keep asking the questions, though. I will try to address all of those that are still standing when we get to the end. One of the things that we can do with Pearl in terms of the multi-channel and multi-encoding nature of it is maybe I want to record my first program channel as I did, full HD, 25 megabit, because I want a super high quality local record. But I can't actually stream at that because I don't have the bandwidth to do it. I can create a second channel. In this case, I'm going to call it Stream 720. if I could type. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to choose my video source as my first channel, which means I'm going to be re-encoding the same content that's being mixed and switched in my first program channel. I'm going to re-encode it at a different level. The other advantage this gives me, coming back to Aldo's question about translators, is that I can re-encode the video by pulling that, but I could choose a totally separate audio input for this. So let's say I need two languages. Here in Canada, there'll be English and French. I could have English coming in on my main program and stream that out. I could re-encode it and choose a different audio input that's drawing audio from the French translator and send that out. So it's pretty straightforward to do this. It's just a question of selecting different audio inputs in different encoding channels. The other thing I'm going to do though is I don't have the bandwidth, so I'm going to drop this down to 720, and I'm going to do it at 2500 instead of 25 megabit, and basically set this up as though I was going to stream it to Facebook just for fun. So now what I have is I have one channel that's my main mixed and switch program feed that has multiple layouts so that I've created, and I'm recording that at a super high level. But now I've created a secondary channel that I'm re-encoding at 720p at a lower bit rate, and I create an RTMP push, and I'm going to pretend I'm sending that to Facebook. Same content, re-encoded. That's a great way to leverage the multitasking and multi-encoding ability of Pearl. But maybe I need to create more. So I'm going to create another channel, and I'm going to say that this is Cam1 ISO. And I'm going to add one input, and it's going to be camera 1, and it's going to be full screen, and I'm going to save that. And then I'll end up just recording that by itself. I'm going to add another channel. And in this one, I'll add my PC input, stretch it to be full screen, save that, and call this one PC ISO. I now have 4 channels, all doing different things, no problem. So this is the way that we can play with these multiple encoding channels and create a bigger multi-use scenario on a single device and manage it all very easily. So that's a fairly common way that we would do this. Managing it might be where Epiphan Live comes into play. So somewhere in here, there was a question from Tom asking about Epiphan Live versus the admin, and how are they generally used? The admin, as the name would suggest, is everything. Everything you could ever configure on a Pearl is done at the administrator level. Of course, you may not want everyone to have access to that, and that's where Epiphan Live comes into play. It's a more operator-oriented dashboard. It's still a browser-based control, which means you can use it in any web browser you want. And it'll even work in a mobile browser. It's actually designed and intended to be used in a mobile browser with a touchscreen style interface if you like. And what you can do here in this dashboard is through a series of these live tiles, you can create essentially a live dashboard where you can see what's happening on the video. You can start and stop recording on all of these different things. So I have my first channel, my second channel, my ISO. I can start and stop recording those. I can start and stop my stream publishing on those. I can look at which inputs are connected at what resolution. I can look at my audio setup. I can even start and stop that multi-track recorder if I want. And then I can also go over to the switching interface, and it's going to show me thumbnails of all of the different layouts that we built, and I can queue them up, and it's going to show me, again, not a full frame rate, but it'll show me a preview of what's happening there video-wise, and I can switch to that one when I'm ready to go live with it. So I can play around with this and really kind of leverage and manipulate, whatever it is. I can even double click on the thumbnails to send them live immediately. This works very well on a touchscreen as well. And the front touchscreen of Pearl, the switching interface, is very similar. Thumbnails along the bottom, a preview queue, and a live queue. So I can preview first and then go, or I can just double click to go now. I can also look at the recorded files here and in the live dashboard, but that's it. I can't change settings. I can't change stream destinations. I can't manipulate network settings. I can't create layouts. I can only choose between what has been created. So the idea here is to streamline it for use by maybe a less experienced operator who we don't really want to be playing with the full admin interface. The day-to-day tasks of start, stop, and switching, monitoring can all be done here. And again, one of the biggest advantages is that this, you could pull this up on your iPad and have maybe a little more physical flexibility. And I believe there was a question in here about control via tablet that Richard asked. Control via tablet, did the Pearl create its own hotspot for the connection? And the answer to that is no. Pearl only has a wired Ethernet. It doesn't have Wi-Fi. But if it's connected to a network that has Wi-Fi access points, then no problem. Then you could use a tablet to control either the full admin or Epiphan Live. But Pearl itself does not have Wi-Fi built in. You would need a network connection that then has a Wi-Fi access point on it. So Aldo's asking, where can you download Epiphan Live? You don't have to download it. It's built into the Pearl. This is hosted from the Pearl itself. It's not an app that you have to download or install. It just works in a web browser, any web browser. It's totally platform agnostic, nothing downloaded. The way I access it is that there's a URL, obviously, that you can favorite and keep as a bookmark. But in the admin, in the upper right-hand corner, there's a link there for Epiphan Live. All right, moving along. There was someone was here asking, Wayne was asking if someone can send a link to the recorded webinar walking through the entire Pearl Mini. That was 2 weeks ago, Wayne, and it is up on our website on the webinar page. It's also in our YouTube channel. After the fact, all of these are being posted to our YouTube channel. Hopefully, I think someone put the link in chat, so check out the link in chat. All right. There were some other questions in here about storage transfer. So Simon was asking about storage transfer. Will the Pearl-2 transfer to USB storage and a NAS at the same time, and can you set priority? So we've talked a little bit about recording. And one of the settings in our recording talked about the automatic file upload rules. Initially, all recordings will be stored to the internal drive, but we can automatically offload them using the automatic file upload rules. When we enable the automatic file upload rules, we can choose which protocol we want to use. Unfortunately, at this time, we can only use one at a time. We can't use multiple types and destinations. So at the moment, we would have to choose between a network server like a NAS, using a protocol like FTP, SFTP, Samba, Windows Share, that kind of thing, or alternatively USB, external USB storage that you can connect directly to Pearl. When we choose one of these protocols, let's say SFTP, it's a fairly common one, then we can also choose how often we will upload those files on rotation or hour, 6, 12, 24 hours. On rotation tends to be one of the popular ones because it means that as soon as a file finishes recording, either meaning that you push stop or that it hit one of those triggers and started on the file, the phone that just finished would be placed in the queue immediately, and assuming it's at the front of the queue, would upload right away in the background while you continue to record. You can have it marked so that you know it was uploaded. You can delete it after it's been uploaded from Pearl's internal storage. There's a few other variables here. So this can be a very powerful tool to move the files from the internal storage to an external drive or external storage on the network just to get the files going, to archive them, back them up, whatever your workflow is. There's a variety of options here. But that's essentially it. The other way that we can do this, and someone asked about this earlier with Kaltura, is Perl can also integrate with a content management system. We currently support two, Kaltura and Panopto. The way that they work are basically the same, in the sense that when you enable them, you register the Perl with the necessary credentials to your Kaltura account. Once it becomes a registered resource for Kaltura, there's a number of things we can do. We can choose which VOD channels, if we want to create VOD things, which channels are going to be part of this, which one we might use for a live stream. And some of this will depend on how we're using Kaltura. Some people will use Kaltura for live streaming and recording uploads. Some people only recording. But you can create a full calendar schedule in Kaltura, as many universities do. And Perl, when it's registered and assigned to that calendar, will download all of those event schedules and start and stop recording or live streaming automatically based on that schedule, and send the asset, the live stream or the recorded files, back to Kaltura based on that schedule. And essentially, Perl can become a hands-off automated device at that point. You don't have to really do any of your own stuff. Generally speaking, the way that Kaltura works, and this is to answer your question, Christian, if you're still there, hopefully, it doesn't support multi-track files. You would do it this way, where you would create multiple channels, like the 4 I have, and choose which ones you want enabled. All 4 files would be uploaded to Kaltura, where you can then manipulate them. One has to be tagged as the main entry, but the other ones can be secondary ones. On the player side in Kaltura, the viewer can choose usually which one they want to see. So it's kind of a yes and no answer, I think. So we do have a ton of other material. Honestly, diving into Kaltura is way bigger, and Panopto is way bigger than I have time for today. We're getting very close to where I need to stop talking. But we do have a ton of other video assets on specifically CMS integration. So check out the YouTube channel about Perl and CMS stuff. I believe we even have some other webinar stuff about it. So please check that out if you're interested in more. Okay, I think I'm going to start wrapping up here by going through the questions. I'm going to be going through them by what's the most upvoted. So if you look at the Q&A panel, you'll see the upvote button there. Upvote what you feel you want answered as a priority, and I'm going to go through those based on upvotes. And if I run out of time in the next 5-10 minutes, then I'm going to have to cut it off. So sorry about that. Top of that list right now. Question here. I suppose I have outside live broadcast that I'm trying to do. Is it possible for me to do an outside broadcast without having to go with the encoder outside the building? You also mentioned something about lip sync. So I'll answer the first part of that. I mean, yes, assuming you can run the video signals from wherever the cameras are placed outside back to the encoder inside. Sure. And there's a number of ways to do that, whether it's with long SDI cables or whatever, or whether some people will use wireless transmitters for that. Outside might not be so bad for that, but really depends on the space, the distance, and so on. I mentioned something about lip sync. How do we adjust those values? So we do that on the individual audio input pages. There's an audio delay setting. That's where we can make corrections if we're having lip sync issues. Next, are we streaming to multiple social media platforms? Does that affect my bandwidth? Yes, absolutely. So earlier we had looked at creating multiple RTMP instances. Again, this is math question. So I had 3 that were going to go to Facebook, YouTube, and Vimeo, just as examples. And if I was doing that at 5 megabit, that's 5 times 3, 15, and I still need to apply my overhead to that. So 15 times, ideally 2, 30. 30 is now my minimum upload speed required to successfully stream to all 3 of those platforms at 1080 at 5 megabit. Next most upvoted. Is there support for switching effects, fades, etc.? Um, Richie, currently no. At this time, Pearl only does a basic cut between those layouts. We don't have options for transitions at the moment. We do find that the vast majority of users typically are using simple cuts 99% of the time. We are looking at potentially adding some fade options in the future. Um, I can say that we certainly probably would never add some of the crazier things like wipes and star wipes and all that kind of stuff that no one ever uses anyways. But fades and dissolves might be something that we add in the future. Currently today, it's not there. All right. Okay, so here's a follow-up here. Lip sync, I answered that in terms of where you adjust that. Also wanted to adjust the levels. So Pearl doesn't have adjustments for digital inputs like HDMI and SDI, but it does have gain settings for the analog inputs. Again, the baseline is Pro line level for plus 4 dBu, and then with a maximum of 30 plus 30 dB of headroom there. So you can adjust that gain if you need to, but again, it's still assuming that it's Pro line level. It is not supporting mic level. Another question here from Kristen. Will Pearl products pass captioning, or are your engineers working on this for the future? It depends on what you mean by pass captioning. If it's embedded metadata that's like part of the SDI standard for closed captioning, no. If it's visually on the video signal already, as so that Pearl literally sees it as no different than any other visual element, yes, absolutely. But we don't decode and re-encode closed captioning metadata as a parallel channel. It would have to be visually part of the video signal. So I hope that answers that question. Um, Richard, does the audio follow video? If so, what happens? It can. It's up to you. Again, coming back to that layouts, I think I touched on this, but you can choose one or more audio inputs on each layout individually. So if you want the audio to follow video, you can set it up that way, or maybe you're using only the analog inputs and none of the HDMI or SDI audio inputs, and that's the only ones you select for all of your layouts. That's also possible. It's totally up to you in terms of how you use that. Scott asking a great question. Can the live script be used as an input to add live text across the bottom of the stream? Would you have to use a physical input and could be done from the network? Currently, it would have to be done from a physical input like HDMI. And we've done that quite a bit ourselves. So what you could do is bring it in as an HDMI signal and then play with the cropping and chroma keying to fine tune how you want it to be an overlay. Um, Whether or not we do a full direct integration over the network down the road is yet to be seen. In this first release for LiveScript, it would have to be done physically over an HDMI signal. Um, Paul, the chroma keying is very basic. It is as you saw there, where basically I can apply it to an input, and that's and key out a selected color. That's pretty much it. I can adjust key threshold and edge blend, but that's it. There's nothing really fancier than that. So it's pretty straightforward. If you want something fancier, sometimes using an NDI input from an external device that supports alpha channel can give you a little more complexity to it. Um, Explain something about lip syncing. Okay, so I talked about that. Secondly, I wanted to know if there's a way to live stream on a social media platforms without having to go, to take the encoder everywhere. Um, yeah, I mean, right now, the way Pearl works is that the inputs would have to be local in some way, HDMI, SDI, NDI. None of them are currently internet routable inputs over the network. So it's not a cloud-based solution, which is I think really where you're going with that question is to physically not have an encoder somewhere and to stream. You're really looking at using a cloud-based encoding system, which I don't have anything really I can talk about today on that, but maybe someday down the road we might have something we can talk about. But I don't have anything to really say there, other than what we're currently doing to do these live streams. And instead of Crowdcast, where you guys are viewing this as a webinar, I could be YouTube, Facebook, whatever I want. I'm remote to where the Pearl is. My producer, Cameron, who's hiding in the background, is remote to the Pearl. We're using Zoom to communicate and then capture the Zoom call into the Pearl, leverage the cropping abilities that we've been talking about, and then stream it back out from the Pearl. So under current conditions, there are ways of doing these things. Wayne, there are places that don't have a network connection? Instead of using a hotspot on an iPhone, is there a better device? Yes, absolutely. What we use is a Netgear MR1100. Netgear MR1100. It is a mobile router modem that you insert your SIM card into. It has an Ethernet jack and Wi-Fi built into it. It has a battery built into it. It even has ports to connect external antennas for it to boost the signal strength for the LTE connection. That's the kind of device I would recommend. It's a mobile hotspot that has Ethernet and Wi-Fi on it, and it will definitely be better than trying to do it with a phone. It'll be faster. It won't be Wi-Fi only because it has Ethernet, and you can connect external antenna, which could be extremely powerful if you're in an area with a weak signal. So that's the one we use. But Peplink makes a bunch. There's even ones with multi-SIM card, load balance. Depends on how much you want to spend. But the Netgear one can be had for a couple $100. Throw a SIM card in there, you're good to go. Pretty straightforward. Aldo, can we copy one preset from one Pearl to another? Yes, absolutely, provided that the Pearls are of the same model. So for example, if I create a configuration preset here, I could download the file. It would download a .preset file. I could then take that and upload it to another Pearl-2. I created it on a Pearl-2. I could take it to another Pearl-2. I could not take it to a Pearl Mini because they have different features. So they're not cross-model compatible, but they are Pearl-2 to Pearl-2, no problem. Pearl Mini to Pearl Mini, no problem. So yes, absolutely. Just download it and then upload it to the other device, hit apply, and you are good to go. All right, I think that's all the questions. We are at the time limit. I'm going to call it there. I'm not going to take any more questions. If you do have any more questions about Pearl, obviously we have tons of information on the website, on our YouTube channel. We have all kinds of use cases in our blogs. We always have our weekly live show, Thursday at 3 o'clock Eastern, every week. Not always talking about Pearl, but talking about all kinds of things. We have another webinar tomorrow, assuming my voice is working, where we're going to be talking about live event production very specifically. So if you're interested in live event production, remote live event production, that kind of thing, check out tomorrow's webinar back here. If you haven't signed up and registered for that, I know a ton of people have. Check that out. Again, live at Epiphan every Thursday, 3 o'clock Eastern, where we're talking about all kinds of things regarding streaming and so on. I'm going to stop my screen share and we are going to get ready to get out of here. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. I hope that this was beneficial, educational, and enjoyable all at the same time. You can always follow up with us over email, info@epiphan.com, live chat on our website. And we will be seeing you soon in the next one. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.